There's a quiet but powerful shift that happens when a person stops obsessing over problems and begins paying attention to solutions. It sounds simple, almost obvious, yet most people spend their entire lives doing the opposite. They replay what went wrong, who is to blame, and why things feel stuck. The mind, almost by habit, keeps circling the same drain. But something interesting happens when attention moves, even slightly, toward what could work instead of what isn't working. Energy changes. Clarity begins to appear. And most importantly, movement becomes possible again. At the heart of this way of thinking is a different relationship with problems. Instead of treating problems as deep, complex puzzles that must be dissected endlessly, they are seen as temporary situations that can be influenced. This doesn't mean ignoring reality or pretending difficulties don't exist. It means choosing not to give problems more weight than they deserve. Many people believe that understanding a problem fully is the key to solving it, but in practice, over-analysis often leads to paralysis. The more you dig into why something is broken, the more stuck you can feel. What if the real leverage lies elsewhere? What if progress comes not from understanding every detail of the problem, but from identifying even the smallest signs of improvement? This perspective changes everything. It shifts attention from what is missing to what is already working, even if only slightly. And those small pieces of what works become the building blocks for something better. Imagine someone stuck in a job they dislike. The natural tendency is to focus on everything that's wrong, the long hours, the lack of recognition, the frustration with management. But staying in that mental loop rarely leads to change. It only reinforces dissatisfaction. Now imagine shifting the focus. Instead of asking, "Why is this job so bad?" the question becomes, "What parts of my day are actually okay?" Or even, "When do I feel slightly less frustrated?" These questions might seem small, but they open doors. They reveal patterns that were previously invisible. This approach is not about blind positivity. It's about direction. Where attention goes, energy follows. When attention is constantly anchored in problems, energy drains. When attention moves toward solutions, even imperfect ones, energy begins to build. That energy fuels action, and action creates change. One of the most practical aspects of this mindset is its emphasis on the future rather than the past. Most people are conditioned to look backward. They search for causes, explanations, and reasons. But the past, while informative, cannot be changed. The future, on the other hand, is still open. By focusing on what you want to be different rather than what has already happened, you start to engage with something you can actually influence. Consider how often conversations revolve around problems. Friends talk about what's going wrong. Teams in workplaces analyze failures in long meetings. Even internal self-talk tends to replay mistakes. Now imagine redirecting those conversations. Instead of asking, "What went wrong?" you ask, "What would better look like?" That single shift changes the tone completely. It moves the conversation from analysis to possibility. And once you begin describing what better looks like, something interesting happens. The mind starts generating pathways. It begins to search for ways to close the gap between the current state and the desired state. This is where creativity lives, not in problem analysis, but in solution building. Another powerful idea is the concept of small, manageable steps. People often feel stuck because they think change requires something dramatic or overwhelming. But real progress rarely works that way. It happens incrementally. When the focus is on solutions, the question becomes, what is the smallest step I can take right now that moves me slightly closer to what I want? This question is disarmingly simple, yet incredibly effective. Small steps reduce resistance. They make action feel possible. And once action begins, momentum follows. It's much easier to continue moving than to start from a standstill. This is why focusing on solutions often leads to faster progress than trying to solve problems completely before acting. There's also a subtle but important shift in how people view themselves. When someone is constantly focused on problems, they often start to see themselves as part of the problem. They feel inadequate, stuck, or incapable. But when the focus shifts to solutions, the identity begins to change. The person becomes someone who can influence outcomes, someone who can create movement, even in small ways. That shift in identity is powerful because it affects not just what you do, happened, who is right, and who is wrong. These discussions often go in circles because both sides are anchored in the past. But when the focus shifts to solutions, the conversation changes. Instead of debating history, both sides start exploring what would make things better moving forward. It becomes less about winning the argument and more about improving the situation. This doesn't mean solutions are always easy or obvious. Sometimes they require creativity, compromise, or patience. But the key difference is that the conversation is now productive. It's oriented toward progress rather than blame. There's also an important lesson about noticing exceptions. Even in the most difficult situations, there are moments when the problem is less intense or even absent. These moments are often overlooked because they don't fit the narrative of the problem. But they hold valuable information. They show what is possible. They reveal conditions under which things improve, even slightly. By paying attention to these exceptions, you begin to understand what works, even if only temporarily. And once you identify what works, you can start to replicate it. This is a far more efficient strategy than trying to eliminate every possible cause of a problem. Over time, this way of thinking becomes more natural. The mind starts to default to solution-focused questions. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" it asks, "What can I do next?" Instead of dwelling on what's broken, it looks for what can be built. This doesn't remove challenges from life, but it changes how those challenges are approached. And perhaps the most powerful aspect of all is that this mindset is accessible to anyone. It doesn't require special knowledge, resources, or circumstances. It only requires a shift in attention, a willingness to look in a different direction, a decision to spend more time exploring possibilities than analyzing limitations. But this shift is not always easy, especially when problems feel overwhelming or deeply rooted. The mind naturally gravitates back to familiar patterns, especially under stress. So the real question becomes, how do you maintain this solution-focused approach when everything around you seems to pull you back into problem-focused thinking? That's where things start to get even more interesting, because sustaining this mindset requires more than just understanding it. It requires specific ways of thinking, asking, and responding that gradually reshape how you interact with challenges on a daily basis. It's one thing to understand the value of focusing on solutions, and something entirely different to actually live that way when pressure builds and emotions take over. In calm moments, it feels obvious to look forward and think constructively. But when frustration, fear, or uncertainty enters the picture, the mind almost automatically slips back into old habits. It starts replaying what went wrong, assigning blame, or imagining worst-case scenarios. That pull is strong, and it's deeply human. So the real work lies not in learning the idea, but in practicing a different response when it matters most. A useful way to begin is by changing the kinds of questions you ask yourself. Questions quietly shape the direction of thought. If you ask, "Why does this always happen to me?" your mind will search for patterns of failure, reinforcing a sense of helplessness. But if you ask, "What would a better outcome look like right now?" something shifts. The brain moves from explanation to imagination. It begins constructing rather than analyzing. This is a small change on the surface, but it has a profound effect on where your attention settles. The quality of these questions matters. Vague or overly ambitious questions can overwhelm the mind. If someone in a difficult situation asks, "How do I completely fix my life?" the scale of that question can lead to inaction. It's too big, too undefined. But if the question becomes, "What would make today slightly better than yesterday?" it suddenly feels approachable. The mind can engage with that. It can generate answers. And those answers often lead to small, meaningful steps. There's also something important about timing. In moments of high emotional intensity, it's often unrealistic to expect clear, solution-focused thinking immediately. The first step may simply be to create a little distance from the reaction. That might mean pausing, stepping away, or even acknowledging the emotion without trying to solve anything right away. Once the intensity softens, even slightly, it becomes easier to redirect attention toward what can be done. Another subtle but powerful habit is learning to notice progress, even when it's minimal. Most people are conditioned to measure success in big, visible outcomes. Reinforce the idea that movement is happening. That sense of movement builds confidence, and confidence fuels further action. Imagine someone trying to improve their health. If they focus only on the end goal, a certain weight, a specific level of fitness, the journey can feel long and discouraging. But if they begin to notice smaller wins, like choosing a healthier meal, taking a short walk, or simply feeling slightly more energetic, the experience changes. These moments become evidence that change is possible. They shift the narrative from "I'm stuck" to "I'm moving." This idea extends into how you interpret setbacks. In a problem-focused mindset, setbacks often feel like confirmation that things aren't working. They reinforce doubt. But in a solution-focused mindset, setbacks are treated differently. They are seen as information, not as final judgments. Instead of asking, "Why did this fail?" the question becomes, "What can I adjust next time?" This keeps the focus on forward motion rather than backward analysis. There's also a practical aspect to how solutions are built. They are rarely perfect from the start. Waiting for the ideal solution can become another form of avoidance. Progress usually comes from trying something, observing the result, and then refining the approach. It's a process of iteration. Each step informs the next. And over time, those adjustments lead to better outcomes. This way of thinking requires a certain level of flexibility. It means being willing to let go of rigid expectations and adapt as you go. It also means accepting that not every attempt will work. But failure, in this context, loses some of its weight. It's no longer a stopping point, it's part of the process. Another important element is language. The words you use, both internally and in conversations with others, shape how situations are perceived. When someone repeatedly says, "This is impossible," it closes off possibilities before they are even explored. But if the language shifts to, "This is difficult, but what might help," it leaves the door open. It creates space for ideas to emerge. This becomes especially important in collaborative environments. In teams, the dominant language often determines the overall direction. If discussions are filled with criticism and problem analysis, progress slows. People become cautious, defensive, or disengaged. But when the conversation centers around possibilities and next steps, the energy changes. People contribute more freely. Ideas build on each other. Movement becomes collective rather than individual. There's also a deeper layer to this approach that touches on belief. At some level, focusing on solutions requires a belief that change is possible. Without that belief, even the best strategies can feel empty. But belief doesn't have to come from certainty. It can come from small experiences of progress. Each time you take a step and see even a slight improvement, that belief strengthens. It becomes more grounded, more real. Over time, this creates a feedback loop. You focus on solutions, you take action, you notice progress, and that progress reinforces your focus. The cycle builds on itself. What once felt unnatural begins to feel automatic. The mind becomes more oriented toward possibilities by default. However, there's a common misunderstanding that focusing on solutions means ignoring deeper issues. That's not the case. Some problems do require reflection and understanding. But the difference lies in proportion. Instead of spending the majority of time analyzing the problem, you spend the majority of time exploring what can be done about it. Reflection becomes a tool, not a destination. There's also an interesting shift in how time is experienced. When you're stuck in problem-focused thinking, time often feels heavy and slow. You replay the same thoughts, and nothing seems to change. But when you're oriented toward solutions, time feels more dynamic. Each moment holds potential for action, even if that action is small. This creates a sense of movement, and movement changes how you experience your own life. As this mindset deepens, it starts to influence not just how you respond to challenges, but how you anticipate them. Instead of fearing difficulties, you begin to see them as situations that can be navigated. This doesn't remove uncertainty, but it changes your relationship with it. You become more willing to engage, to try, and to adapt. And yet, even with all of this, there's still a question that lingers beneath the surface. If focusing on solutions is so effective, why do so many people remain stuck in problem-focused thinking? What are the subtle habits and hidden patterns that keep pulling attention back to what's wrong instead of what's possible? If you look closely at how most people think throughout the day, you start to notice a pattern that feels almost automatic. The mind scans for what's wrong. It highlights risks, replays mistakes, and anticipates problems before they even happen. This isn't a personal flaw. It's a deeply ingrained survival mechanism. For most of human history, paying attention to what could go wrong was essential for staying alive. The brain learned to prioritize threats over possibilities because, in a dangerous environment, that focus increased the chances of survival. But in modern life, that same mechanism often works against us. The threats we face are rarely life or death, yet the brain responds as if they are. A difficult conversation, a missed opportunity, or an uncertain future can trigger the same pattern of problem-focused thinking. The mind latches onto what's wrong and holds it there, even when that focus doesn't help us move forward. In fact, it often does the opposite. It keeps us stuck in a loop of analysis without action. Understanding this changes how you relate to your own thoughts. Instead of seeing negative or problem-focused thinking as something to fight against, you begin to recognize it as a default setting. And once you see it that way, you realize something important: default settings can be adjusted. Not instantly, and not without effort, but gradually, through consistent awareness and small shifts in behavior. One of the most subtle patterns that keeps people stuck is the need for certainty. Before taking action, many people feel they need to fully understand the situation, predict the outcome, and eliminate the risk of failure. On the surface, this seems reasonable. But in practice, it creates hesitation. Life rarely offers complete certainty, and waiting for it often means waiting indefinitely. A solution-focused approach challenges this need. It replaces certainty with experimentation. Instead of asking, "Will this definitely work?" the question becomes, "What can I try?" That shift may seem small, but it removes a significant barrier to action. It allows you to move forward without having all the answers. And interestingly, action itself often creates the clarity that thinking alone cannot provide. There's also a strong emotional component tied to problem-focused thinking. Problems tend to feel heavy. They carry a sense of urgency, frustration, or even fear. When those emotions build up, they narrow your perspective. You start seeing fewer options, not because they don't exist, but because your attention is constrained. It's like looking through a tunnel where only the problem is visible. Shifting towards solutions gradually widens that tunnel. It doesn't eliminate the emotional weight immediately, but it introduces new elements into the picture. Possibilities, options, and small steps begin to appear alongside the problem. This broader view makes it easier to act, even if the situation hasn't fully improved yet. Another pattern worth noticing is how identity becomes entangled with problems. Over time, people can start to define themselves by what they struggle with. Someone might see themselves as bad with money, unlucky in relationships, or not disciplined enough. These labels feel descriptive, but they quietly shape behavior. When you identify with a problem, it becomes harder to imagine acting outside of it. A solution-focused mindset gently disrupts this pattern. It shifts attention from identity to behavior. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" the focus becomes, "What can I do differently in this situation?" This creates distance between who you are and what you're experiencing. And in that distance, there's room for change. There's also an interesting relationship between attention and evidence. The mind tends to look for proof that supports its current focus. If you're focused on problems, you'll notice more things that confirm how stuck or difficult things are. But if you begin to focus on solutions, you start noticing opportunities, resources, and small signs of progress that were previously invisible. This isn't about ignoring reality or forcing positivity. It's about recognizing that attention is selective. You can't notice everything at once, so where you choose to focus matters. And over time, that focus shapes your perception of what's possible. In practical terms, one of the most effective ways to shift this pattern is by deliberately redirecting attention in small moments. When you catch yourself replaying a problem, you don't need to force yourself to stop thinking about it entirely. Instead, you can gently ask, "What's one thing I can do next?" The question doesn't need to produce a perfect answer. It just needs to move your attention slightly forward. This process is less about dramatic breakthroughs and want to return to familiar patterns. But with repetition, the new approach becomes more accessible. It starts to feel like a natural response rather than a forced one. Another layer of this approach involves how you handle complexity. Some situations genuinely are complicated. They involve multiple variables, conflicting interests, or uncertain outcomes. In these cases, the temptation is to step back and try to understand everything before acting. But often, the more effective approach is to simplify the next step. Instead of trying to solve the entire situation, you narrow your focus to what can be influenced right now. This might mean having a single conversation, testing a small idea, or making a minor adjustment. By breaking complexity into manageable pieces, you create entry points for action. And once action begins, even complex situations start to shift. There's also a quiet discipline required in letting go of unproductive thinking. Some thoughts feel important simply because they're persistent. The mind keeps returning to them, as if repetition gives them value. But not all thoughts deserve your attention. Learning to notice when thinking becomes repetitive and unhelpful is a key part of staying solution-focused. This doesn't mean suppressing thoughts or pretending they don't exist. It means choosing not to engage with them endlessly. You acknowledge the thought, and then you redirect your focus to something more constructive. Over time, this reduces the influence those patterns have over you. As this way of thinking develops, something subtle but powerful begins to change. You become less reactive and more intentional. Instead of being pulled in different directions by problems, you start choosing where to direct your energy. That sense of choice creates a feeling of control, even in situations that are uncertain or challenging. And yet, there's still another layer to explore. Because focusing on solutions is not just an individual practice, it also shapes how you influence others, how you lead, and how you create environments where progress becomes natural rather than forced. When this mindset extends beyond your own thinking and begins to affect the people around you, its impact becomes even more significant. Something shifts in a very noticeable way when a person who consistently focuses on solutions begins to interact with others. It's no longer just a personal mindset, it becomes a kind of quiet influence that changes the tone of conversations, decisions, and even group dynamics. Without needing to announce it, that person starts guiding attention away from what's stuck and toward what's possible. And in many cases, that subtle shift is enough to unlock progress where there was none before. In most environments, whether it's a workplace, a family, or a group of friends, conversations tend to drift toward problems by default. People describe what isn't working, who made a mistake, or why something failed. These discussions can feel productive on the surface, but they often circle the same points without creating movement. Over time, this pattern can drain energy from the group. People begin to associate challenges with frustration rather than possibility. Now imagine introducing a different kind of presence into that environment. Someone listens carefully, acknowledges the issue, but doesn't stay there for long. Instead of expanding on the problem, they gently redirect the conversation. They might ask, "What would we like to see happen instead?" or "What's one thing we could try next?" These questions don't dismiss the problem, but they prevent it from dominating the entire discussion. What's interesting is how quickly this changes the atmosphere. People who were previously focused on explaining or defending themselves begin to think differently. The conversation becomes less about justification and more about contribution. Even those who are initially skeptical often find themselves engaging with the new direction simply because it feels more constructive. This approach is especially powerful in leadership, though it doesn't require a formal title. Anyone can influence a group by consistently steering attention towards solutions. In fact, some of the most effective leaders are not the ones who have all the answers, but the ones who ask the right questions. They create space for others to think, to contribute, and to move forward together. There's also an important balance here. Focusing on solutions doesn't mean ignoring people's experiences or emotions. If someone feels frustrated or discouraged, jumping straight to solutions without acknowledging that can feel dismissive. The key is to recognize the emotion briefly, without letting it take over the entire conversation. It's a kind of quiet respect. You see the shifting to, what would help improve this situation? That transition is subtle, but it keeps the conversation grounded while still moving it forward. Another layer of influence comes from consistency. One solution-focused question might not change a deeply ingrained pattern in a group, but repeated over time, it starts to reshape expectations. People begin to anticipate that conversations will move toward action rather than staying in analysis. Eventually, they start asking those questions themselves. This is how culture changes, not through dramatic declarations, but through small, repeated behaviors. The questions people ask, the language they use, and the direction they choose to focus on all contribute to the environment they create. And once that environment becomes more solution-oriented, progress tends to accelerate naturally. There's also a deeper level of trust that develops in these kinds of environments. When people know that mistakes won't lead to endless blame or criticism, they become more willing to take initiative. They're less afraid of trying something new because they trust that the focus will remain on learning and improving rather than assigning fault. This doesn't mean accountability disappears. It simply changes form. Instead of asking, "Who caused this?" the question becomes, "What can we learn from this, and what do we do next?" Accountability shifts from being about punishment to being about responsibility for improvement. In relationships, this mindset can be just as transformative. Many conflicts persist not because the issue is unsolvable, but because both sides are anchored in proving their perspective. Each person wants to be understood, which is natural, but the conversation often gets stuck in the past. Who said what, who did what, and why it was wrong. When one person begins to shift toward solutions, the dynamic can change. Instead of continuing to revisit the same points, they might ask, "What would make this better for both of us moving forward?" This question doesn't erase the past, but it reduces its grip on the present. It invites collaboration rather than opposition. Of course, not every situation will immediately respond to this approach. Some people may resist, especially if they are deeply invested in the problem-focused narrative. In those cases, the most effective strategy is often patience. Continuing to model solution-focused thinking without forcing it gradually creates an alternative path that others can choose to follow when they're ready. There's also something important about humility in this process. Focusing on solutions doesn't mean assuming you always know the best answer. In fact, it often means being open to not knowing and being willing to explore possibilities together. This openness makes it easier for others to contribute, and it leads to more creative and effective outcomes. Over time, this way of interacting begins to feel natural. You start to notice when conversations drift into unproductive territory, and you develop a gentle ability to guide them back. Not forcefully, not abruptly, but in a way that feels almost effortless. And the more this happens, the more others begin to adopt the same approach. What's fascinating is how this extends beyond immediate interactions. It begins to influence how decisions are made, how challenges are approached, and even how goals are set. Instead of being driven by fear of problems, actions become guided by clarity of direction. People focus more on what they want to build than on what they want to avoid. And yet, even with all these shifts, there's one final layer that often determines whether this mindset truly sticks over the long term. Because understanding it, practicing it individually, and even applying it in groups is one thing. But maintaining it consistently, especially during periods of uncertainty or pressure, requires something deeper. It raises a question that goes beyond techniques or strategies. How do you make this way of thinking a stable part of who you are, rather than something you occasionally remember when things are going well? There comes a point where focusing on solutions is no longer something you consciously try to do, but something that begins to feel like your natural way of moving through life. It's not forced, and it doesn't require constant reminders. It becomes part of how you see situations, how you interpret challenges, and how you decide what to do next. But reaching that point isn't about. The real test of this mindset appears during uncertainty. When things are unclear, when outcomes are unpredictable, and when there's no obvious path forward, the mind naturally searches for stability. And often, it tries to find that stability by analyzing problems more deeply, as if more thinking will create more control. But in reality, uncertainty doesn't respond well to over-analysis. It responds better to movement, even if that movement is small and imperfect. In these moments, focusing on solutions becomes less about finding the right answer and more about maintaining direction. You may not know exactly where a path leads, but you can still choose a step that moves you forward. That step might not solve everything, but it changes your position. And once your position changes, new options become visible that weren't available before. There's a quiet confidence that develops from this approach. Not the kind of confidence that comes from certainty or guaranteed outcomes, but a more grounded kind, the confidence that you can respond, adjust, and continue moving no matter what happens. This confidence isn't loud or dramatic. It's steady. It shows up in how you handle setbacks, how you make decisions, and how you carry yourself through difficult situations. One of the deeper shifts that supports this mindset is learning to separate progress from perfection. Many people unknowingly tie these two together. They feel that if something isn't done perfectly, it doesn't count as real progress. But this creates unnecessary pressure and often leads to inaction. A solution-focused approach loosens that connection. It allows progress to exist in incomplete, evolving forms. This means you can take action without needing everything to be fully resolved. You can improve something without needing it to be flawless. And over time, those imperfect actions accumulate into meaningful change. The path becomes clearer not because you planned it perfectly, but because you walked it consistently. There's also a relationship between this mindset and patience. Focusing on solutions doesn't guarantee immediate results. Some changes take time to unfold, and not every effort produces a visible outcome right away. Without patience, it's easy to become discouraged and slip back into problem-focused thinking. But with patience, you begin to trust the process. You understand that small steps, repeated over time, create shifts that are often invisible in the moment but significant in the long run. This patience is not passive. It doesn't mean waiting without action. It means continuing to move, even when the results are not yet obvious. It's an active form of persistence, grounded in the belief that direction matters more than speed. Another important layer is how you handle moments of failure. No matter how solution-focused you become, there will be times when things don't work out. Plans fall apart. Efforts don't produce the expected results. In those moments, the old patterns can quickly resurface. The mind may start questioning decisions, abilities, or even the entire approach. But this is where the mindset proves its strength. Instead of interpreting failure as a stopping point, you begin to see it as part of the path. Not in an abstract or overly optimistic way, but in a practical sense. Each outcome, whether successful or not, provides information. It tells you something about what works, what doesn't, and what might need to change. The key is to stay engaged with that information without getting pulled into self-judgment. It's not about ignoring mistakes, but about using them constructively. You look at what happened, extract what's useful, and then decide on the next step. The focus remains forward, even when reflecting on the past. Over time, this creates a kind of resilience that feels different from traditional ideas of toughness. It's not about pushing through or forcing yourself to endure. It's about adaptability, the ability to adjust without losing direction, the willingness to continue without needing everything to go as planned. There's also something worth noticing about how this mindset affects your sense of control. Many people feel out of control because they focus on things they cannot influence. External events, other people's actions, unpredictable outcomes. When attention stays there, it naturally leads to frustration. But when you shift your focus to what you can influence, even in small ways, the experience changes. You may not control the entire situation, but you can control your response. You can choose your next step. You can decide where to place your attention. And those choices, repeated over time, create a sense of agency that feels much more stable than trying to control everything. As this becomes more integrated, situations to navigate. This doesn't make life easy, but it makes it more manageable. It creates space for clarity, even in the middle of difficulty. And perhaps one of the most meaningful changes is how this mindset shapes your overall outlook. Instead of seeing the future as something uncertain and potentially threatening, you begin to see it as something open. Not guaranteed, not perfectly predictable, but open to influence. Open to change. Open to improvement. This sense of openness doesn't come from ignoring reality. It comes from engaging with it differently. From choosing, again and again, to focus on what can be built rather than what is broken. In the end, focusing on solutions is less about a technique and more about a way of being. It's a quiet orientation toward progress, a steady commitment to movement, and a willingness to keep adjusting as you go. It doesn't require perfection, and it doesn't promise certainty. But it offers something far more practical, a way to keep moving forward, no matter where you start or what you're facing. And once that way of thinking becomes part of you, it doesn't just change how you handle problems. It changes how you see possibilities, how you approach your goals, and ultimately, how you shape the direction of your life. After a while, something almost unnoticeable begins to happen. You stop thinking of challenges as interruptions to your life and start seeing them as part of the structure of it. They are no longer events that throw you off course, but situations that ask for a response. And because you've trained your attention to lean toward solutions, your first instinct is no longer resistance or frustration, but quiet curiosity. That curiosity changes the entire experience. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening?" you begin asking, "What can be done with this?" It's a subtle shift, but it carries a very different energy. One question looks for explanation, the other looks for direction. And direction, even if it's uncertain, always feels lighter than confusion. This is where the mindset matures. It moves beyond effort and becomes perspective. You don't need to remind yourself constantly to focus on solutions, because your mind has learned that this is the most useful place to go. It has seen, again and again, that progress comes from forward movement, not backward analysis. So it starts choosing that path more naturally. But what's interesting is that this doesn't make life predictable or perfectly controlled. In fact, in some ways, it makes you more aware of how unpredictable things really are. The difference is that unpredictability no longer feels like a threat. It feels like something you can work with. You begin to trust your ability to respond in real time, rather than relying on fixed plans. Plans still have value, but they are no longer something you cling to rigidly. They become flexible guides instead of strict rules. And when circumstances change, as they often do, you adjust without feeling like everything is falling apart. There's a certain calm that comes with this. Not because everything is going well, but because you're no longer dependent on everything going well. You understand that even when things don't unfold as expected, you still have the ability to move, to adapt, and to find a way forward. This calm also affects how you make decisions. Many people struggle with decisions because they feel the need to choose the perfect option. They weigh every possibility, trying to avoid mistakes. But this often leads to hesitation or second guessing. When you're focused on solutions, decisions are seen differently. They are not final judgments, they are starting points. You choose a direction, take a step, and then adjust based on what happens next. This reduces the pressure to get everything right from the beginning. It allows you to move with more ease, knowing that you can course correct along the way. There's also a deeper sense of responsibility that develops, but it doesn't feel heavy. It feels practical. You stop waiting for ideal conditions, perfect timing, or external validation. Instead, you begin to work with what you have, where you are. You recognize that while you can't control everything, you can always influence something. That sense of influence becomes a quiet source of strength. It's not about controlling outcomes, but about staying engaged with the process. And when you stay engaged, you remain in motion. Even small actions keep you connected to progress. Over time, this changes how you view effort itself. Effort is no longer something you associate with struggle or pressure. It becomes a natural expression of moving forward. You do what you can, adjust when needed, and continue. There's less friction in the process because you're not fighting reality, you'll become part of the rhythm of progress. Sometimes things move smoothly, sometimes they don't. But in both cases, the focus remains the same: what's the next step? And that question becomes almost automatic. It shows up in small moments throughout the day. When something doesn't go as planned, when a conversation doesn't land the way you expected, when an opportunity falls through. Instead of lingering on what went wrong, your mind gently shifts forward. What's next? That question carries a kind of quiet power. It doesn't demand a perfect answer. It simply keeps you moving. And movement, even when it's slow, changes your relationship with time. You no longer feel stuck waiting for things to improve. You feel involved in the process of improvement. There's also an interesting effect on how you relate to other people. You become less reactive to their behavior because your focus is less on judging what they did and more on deciding how you want to respond. This creates space in interactions. Space to choose your words more carefully, to act more intentionally, and to avoid being pulled into unproductive patterns. In a way, you start to operate with a clearer boundary between what is yours to manage and what isn't. Other people's actions, opinions, and decisions remain outside your control. But your response, your direction, and your next step stay firmly within it. And that clarity reduces unnecessary frustration. As this way of thinking becomes more stable, it begins to influence your long-term direction as well. Goals are no longer distant, intimidating endpoints. They become ongoing processes made up of many small, consistent actions. You don't need to have everything figured out in advance. You just need to keep moving in a direction that makes sense, adjusting as you learn more along the way. This makes growth feel more accessible. It's no longer something reserved for specific moments of motivation or inspiration. It becomes part of your everyday life. Each small decision, each adjustment, each step forward contributes to a larger trajectory. And perhaps the most subtle change of all is how you begin to trust the process of your own thinking. You're no longer caught in cycles of doubt or over-analysis. You don't need to solve everything in your head before taking action. You think, you act, you observe, and you adjust. That rhythm becomes reliable. At that point, focusing on solutions is no longer something you practice. It's something you live. It shows up in how you approach challenges, how you make decisions, and how you move through uncertainty. It becomes part of your default way of engaging with the world. And once that shift is complete, life starts to feel less like something that happens to you and more like something you actively shape, one small, thoughtful step at a time. At a certain point, the change becomes so integrated that it's no longer something you notice in obvious ways. It's not a technique you apply or a mindset you consciously switch into. It becomes the background of how you think, how you respond, and how you move through your days. And what makes this stage interesting is that it feels almost ordinary. There's no dramatic sense of transformation, no constant awareness that you're doing something differently. Yet the results, over time, are anything but ordinary. You begin to realize that much of what once felt heavy was not just the situations themselves, but the way your attention interacted with them. When attention was fixed on problems, everything felt more rigid, more overwhelming, and more difficult to navigate. Now, with attention naturally leaning toward solutions, there's a certain lightness, not because challenges have disappeared, but because they no longer define your experience in the same way. This lightness shows up in small, everyday moments. A delay, an inconvenience, an unexpected change, things that might have previously triggered frustration now pass through your awareness with less resistance. You notice them, you adjust, and you continue. There's less emotional build-up because there's less attachment to how things should have gone. And this is where a deeper form of efficiency begins to emerge. When you're not spending large amounts of mental energy replaying problems, you have more capacity available for action, creativity, and decision-making. It's not that you're working harder. In many cases, you're actually working with less internal friction. The same effort produces more progress simply because it's directed more clearly. There's also a shift in how you relate to time and urgency. When you're problem-focused, everything can feel urgent because problems demand attention. They create a sense that something must be fixed immediately, even when that urgency isn't true. Feels urgent because it's uncomfortable. This distinction allows for better pacing. You don't rush unnecessarily, but you also don't delay what matters. You move with a steadier rhythm, guided more by clarity than by pressure. And over time, this rhythm leads to more sustainable progress. You're not constantly starting and stopping, reacting and recovering. You're moving forward in a more continuous way. Another subtle but important change is how you experience responsibility. Earlier, responsibility might have felt like a burden, something tied to expectations, pressure, or fear of failure. But now, it starts to feel more like ownership. Not ownership in a heavy sense, but in a practical one. You take responsibility for your direction, your actions, and your responses, not because you have to, but because it gives you influence. This kind of ownership is empowering because it keeps you engaged. You're not waiting for things to change or for someone else to fix a situation. You're actively participating in shaping what happens next. And even when outcomes are uncertain, that participation creates a sense of involvement that feels far more stable than passively hoping for improvement. There's also a noticeable change in how you evaluate progress. Instead of measuring success only by results, you begin to value consistency. Showing up, taking steps, adjusting when needed, these become meaningful in themselves. And ironically, this focus on consistency often leads to better results anyway, because it keeps you moving even when motivation fluctuates. In this stage, comparison with others also starts to lose its grip. When you're focused on problems, it's easy to look at others and feel behind or inadequate. Their success highlights your perceived gaps. But when you're focused on solutions and your own direction, that comparison becomes less relevant. You're more engaged with your own path, your own next step, your own progress. This doesn't mean you stop learning from others. In fact, you may become more open to it. But the learning is no longer filtered through insecurity. It becomes practical. You observe what works, adapt what's useful, and continue moving in a way that fits your own situation. There's also an interesting relationship between this mindset and long-term vision. Earlier, thinking about the future might have felt overwhelming because it was tied to uncertainty and unanswered questions. But now, the future feels more like an extension of what you're already doing. You don't need to have everything mapped out. You trust that by continuing to take thoughtful steps, you'll gradually shape the direction. This trust doesn't come from blind optimism. It comes from experience. You've seen that progress is possible, that adjustments can be made, and that movement creates opportunities. That evidence builds a quiet confidence that doesn't depend on predicting every outcome. As a result, you become more willing to take on challenges that once felt intimidating. Not because they've become easier, but because your relationship with difficulty has changed. You no longer see challenges as something that must be perfectly managed before you begin. You see them as something you can engage with, step by step. There's also a kind of mental clarity that develops. With less attention tied up in unproductive loops, your thinking becomes more direct. You're able to identify what matters more quickly, decide more efficiently, and act with less hesitation. This doesn't mean you never reflect or consider options. It simply means that your thinking is more aligned with action rather than stuck in endless evaluation. And perhaps one of the most meaningful outcomes of all is the sense of alignment that begins to appear. Your thoughts, actions, and direction start to feel more connected. You're not constantly pulled in different directions by conflicting priorities or unresolved concerns. You have a clearer sense of where you're going and how you're moving toward it, even if the path is still unfolding. At this stage, focusing on solutions is no longer something you think about. It's something that quietly shapes everything else. It influences how you start your day, how you respond to interruptions, how you handle decisions, and how you close the day. And yet, even here, there's still room for refinement. Because no matter how natural this mindset becomes, life will continue to present new levels of complexity, new kinds of challenges, and new situations that test your ability to stay grounded in this way of thinking. The journey doesn't really end, it evolves. As life expands, the challenges don't just increase in number, they evolve in complexity. The decisions carry more weight, the consequences stretch further, and the margin for error can feel smaller. It's in this phase that many people, even those who have developed a strong solution-focused mindset, feel a subtle pull backward. The stakes make problems look bigger, more serious, and more demanding of attention. The mind starts whispering that maybe this time, more analysis is needed, more caution, more hesitation. But this is where the depth of the mindset truly reveals itself. Because focusing on solutions at a higher level is not about ignoring complexity, it's about engaging with it without losing direction. It's about maintaining clarity even when the situation itself is layered and uncertain. One of the first things that becomes clear at this stage is that not all problems are meant to be solved in the traditional sense. Some situations are ongoing. They require management, adjustment, and navigation rather than a final resolution. Trying to fix everything can lead to frustration because certain aspects of life are dynamic by nature. They shift, they evolve, and they require continuous attention. A solution-focused approach adapts to this reality. Instead of seeking permanent fixes, it looks for ways to improve the current state. It asks, how can this be handled better, rather than how can this be eliminated completely? This subtle shift reduces unnecessary pressure and keeps you engaged with what's actually possible. There's also a deeper understanding that emerges around trade-offs. At higher levels of responsibility, every decision involves compromise. Choosing one path often means letting go of another. When you're problem-focused, these trade-offs can feel like losses. You dwell on what you're giving up, what might go wrong, or what you can't control. But when you're solution-focused, you start evaluating trade-offs differently. You look at what each option enables rather than what it lacks. You accept that no choice is perfect, and instead of searching for the ideal scenario, you choose the one that moves you in the most meaningful direction. This reduces indecision and allows you to act with greater clarity. Another important shift is how you handle uncertainty over longer time horizons. Earlier, focusing on the next small step was enough. And that remains true. But as responsibilities grow, you also need to think further ahead. The key is to balance long-term direction with short-term action. You hold a general sense of where you want to go, but you don't try to control every detail along the way. You make decisions that align with that direction, while staying flexible enough to adjust as new information appears. This balance prevents you from becoming either too reactive or too rigid. There's also a refinement in how you filter information. At higher levels, you're exposed to more input, opinions, data, risks, possibilities. Not all of it is equally useful. A problem, focused mind can get overwhelmed here, trying to process everything, anticipate every issue, and prepare for every outcome. A solution, focused mind becomes more selective. It pays attention to what directly influences action and lets go of what doesn't. This doesn't mean ignoring important details, but it does mean prioritizing clarity over completeness. You don't need to know everything to move forward. You need to know enough to take the next step intelligently. This stage also brings a stronger awareness of energy, not just time. You begin to notice that where you place your attention affects not only your results, but your capacity. Constantly focusing on problems drains energy, even if you're not taking action. It creates a kind of mental fatigue that makes everything feel heavier. On the other hand, focusing on solutions tends to generate energy. It creates a sense of movement, possibility, and engagement. Over time, you become more protective of your attention because you understand its impact. You become more intentional about what you dwell on and what you redirect. There's also a growing appreciation for simplicity. Not simplistic thinking, but clear thinking. When situations become complex, the temptation is to respond with equally complex solutions. But often, the most effective path forward is surprisingly simple. A clear decision, a direct conversation, a small but meaningful adjustment. The challenge is that simplicity can be overlooked because it doesn't always feel sophisticated. But with experience, you begin to trust it more. You recognize that clarity often cuts through complexity more effectively than over-engineering ever could. Relationships also take on a different dimension at this level. You're not just influencing conversation, families. A consistent focus on solutions creates a kind of stability that others begin to rely on. In moments of uncertainty, people look for direction. And when you consistently bring clarity and forward movement, you become a reference point. Not because you have all the answers, but because you maintain orientation when others feel lost. This comes with responsibility, but it also reinforces your own mindset. Teaching, guiding, or simply modeling this way of thinking deepens your understanding of it. It becomes more ingrained because you're not only applying it for yourself, but extending it to others. At the same time, there's a need to remain grounded. As your influence grows, it's easy to feel pressure to always be certain, always have solutions, always move things forward. But the strength of this mindset has never been about having perfect answers. It has always been about maintaining direction. Sometimes the most solution-focused response is to pause, to gather more information, or to acknowledge that the next step isn't clear yet. But even in those moments, the orientation remains forward. You're not stuck in the problem, you're simply preparing for the next move. And perhaps the most important realization at this stage is that focusing on solutions is not a destination. It's a continuous practice that evolves with you. As your life changes, as your challenges grow, and as your responsibilities expand, the way you apply this mindset will adapt. But the core remains the same. You direct your attention toward what can be done. You take steps, even when they are small. You adjust as you go. And you keep moving, not perfectly, but consistently. In the end, this approach doesn't just help you solve problems. It shapes how you experience life itself. It turns uncertainty into something navigable, complexity into something manageable, and challenges into opportunities for movement. And once that perspective becomes deeply rooted, you realize that no matter how much things change around you, you carry something stable within you, a way of thinking that keeps you moving forward, again and again, through whatever comes next. At a certain level of depth, something even more subtle begins to take shape. It's no longer just about how you handle problems or how you move toward solutions. It's about how you relate to thinking itself. You start to notice that not every thought deserves your attention, and more importantly, not every thought deserves to guide your direction. Earlier, the shift was about moving from problems to solutions. Now, the shift becomes more refined. It's about choosing which thoughts to engage with and which ones to let pass. Because even a solution-focused mind can get pulled into unnecessary loops if it treats every thought as important. There's a kind of mental discipline that develops here, but it doesn't feel rigid. It feels selective. You begin to recognize patterns in your thinking, certain concerns that repeat without leading anywhere, certain doubts that appear out of habit rather than necessity. And instead of following them automatically, you start to pause. That pause is small, almost invisible, but it changes everything. It creates a space between the thought and your response. And in that space, you have a choice. You can follow the old path, or you can redirect your attention toward something more useful. This is where focusing on solutions reaches a deeper level. It's no longer just about asking better questions, it's about deciding which mental paths are worth walking down in the first place. You begin to see that some problems are not external at all. They are created and sustained by repeated thinking. The more attention you give them, the more real they feel. But when you stop feeding them with constant focus, they begin to lose their intensity. This doesn't mean ignoring real challenges. It means recognizing the difference between productive thinking and repetitive thinking. Productive thinking leads to action, decisions, or clarity. Repetitive thinking leads back to where it started, often with more frustration than before. Once you can tell the difference, it becomes easier to shift your attention intentionally. You don't get pulled as easily into loops that don't serve you. And when you do notice yourself slipping into one, you can step out of it more quickly. There's also a deeper sense of mental freedom that comes with this. You're no longer at the mercy of every thought that appears. You don't have to solve everything immediately. You don't have to engage with every concern. You can choose where your attention goes, and that choice becomes one of the most powerful tools you have. This changes how you experience pressure as well. Pressure often comes not just from external weight of it, but when you simplify your thinking and return to the question of what can actually be done next, that pressure often reduces. The situation itself may not have changed, but your relationship to it has. It becomes more manageable because you're no longer carrying unnecessary mental load. Another interesting shift at this stage is how you relate to outcomes. Earlier, the focus was on taking action and adjusting as you go. That remains true. But now, there's less emotional attachment to specific results. Not because results don't matter, but because you understand that outcomes are influenced by many factors, not all of which are within your control. Instead of tying your sense of progress or satisfaction to a single outcome, you begin to value the process more deeply. You pay attention to whether you're thinking clearly, acting intentionally, and adjusting when needed. Those become the markers of progress, regardless of how any single situation turns out. This creates a more stable sense of direction. You're not constantly reacting to outcomes, shifting your mindset based on success or failure. You remain grounded in your approach, which allows you to navigate both positive and negative results with more balance. There's also a quiet confidence that emerges from this level of clarity. It's not based on always being right or always succeeding. It's based on knowing that you can handle whatever comes next, that you can think clearly, act appropriately, and adjust when needed. This confidence is subtle, but it's powerful. It reduces hesitation, not because you're certain of the outcome, but because you trust your ability to respond. And that trust makes it easier to move forward, even in uncertain situations. As this becomes more natural, you start to notice how much of life is shaped by attention. What you focus on grows in importance. What you repeatedly think about becomes more real in your experience. And what you choose to act on determines the direction you move in. This awareness brings a kind of intentionality to everyday life. You're not just reacting to what happens. You're actively shaping your experience by choosing where to place your attention and energy. And yet, this doesn't make life feel controlled or rigid. In many ways, it feels more open. Because you're no longer trying to manage everything. You're simply engaging with what matters, step by step. There's also a sense of ease that develops here. Not because everything is easy, but because you're no longer creating unnecessary resistance. You're not fighting your thoughts, not overanalyzing every situation, not trying to force perfect outcomes. You're working with what's in front of you in a clear and steady way. At this point, focusing on solutions is no longer just a strategy for dealing with problems. It becomes a lens through which you experience life. A way of filtering what matters from what doesn't. A way of maintaining direction, even when things are unclear. And perhaps the most important realization is this: the quality of your life is deeply connected to the quality of your attention. Not just what happens to you, but how you engage with it. Once you see that clearly, the practice becomes simple. Not always easy, but simple. You notice where your attention is going, and when necessary, you guide it back toward what is useful, what is constructive, and what moves you forward. And in doing so, you create a kind of internal stability that doesn't depend on external conditions, a steady way of thinking that stays with you, no matter what changes around you. At the deepest level, everything begins to feel quieter. Not in the sense that life becomes silent or free of challenges, but in the way your mind engages with it. The constant noise of overthinking, the urgency to fix everything at once, the pull toward every problem that appears, all of that begins to settle. What replaces it is a kind of steady awareness, one that doesn't rush, doesn't cling, and doesn't get easily pulled off course. You start to realize that focusing on solutions was never just about productivity or effectiveness. It was about how you relate to reality itself. It was about learning to meet situations as they are, without immediately turning them into something heavier through excessive thought. And from that place, choosing a direction that leads somewhere better. There's a sense of simplicity that returns, but it's not the simplicity of inexperience. It's the simplicity that comes after understanding complexity. You've seen how easily the mind can get lost in analysis, how quickly attention can become scattered, and how unproductive that can be. So now, there's a natural preference for clarity. You look at a situation, and instead of asking 10 different questions, you ask one that matters, something actionable. And what's interesting is that this doesn't make you less thoughtful. If anything, it makes your thinking more precise. You're no longer spending energy on things that don't lead anywhere. You're directing your thinking toward movement, toward decisions, toward progress. There's also a deeper acceptance that develops, not passive acceptance, but practical acceptance. You begin to see that reality doesn't need to be resisted in order to be changed. In fact, resistance often slows down the very progress you're trying to make. When something doesn't go as expected, you don't spend as much time wishing it were different. You acknowledge it, and then you move to the next step. That shift alone saves an enormous amount of mental energy that can now be used for action instead of frustration. This acceptance also changes how you deal with uncertainty. Earlier, uncertainty might have felt like something that needed to be reduced or eliminated before you could move forward. But now, you see that uncertainty is simply part of the process. It doesn't block action, it accompanies it. You move forward with partial information, knowing that clarity often comes after action, not before it. And because you trust your ability to adjust, you don't need to wait for perfect conditions. There's also a refinement in how you experience control. You no longer try to control outcomes in a rigid way. Instead, you focus on influencing direction. You make decisions, take steps, and stay engaged with the process. The outcome matters, but it's no longer something you try to force. This creates a more balanced relationship with success and failure. Success is appreciated, but it doesn't define you. Failure is acknowledged, but it doesn't stop you. Both become part of the same process, feedback that helps you adjust your direction. At this stage, there's also a noticeable reduction in internal conflict. Earlier, decisions might have been accompanied by second guessing, doubt, or hesitation. Now, once a decision is made, you move with it. Not blindly, but with a willingness to see it through and adjust if needed. This reduces friction in your actions. You're not constantly pulling yourself in different directions. Your energy becomes more focused, more consistent, and more effective. There's also a sense of presence that emerges, because your attention is no longer trapped in past problems or future worries. You're more engaged with what's in front of you. You see situations more clearly, respond more appropriately, and make better use of the moment you're in. And this presence isn't something you force. It's a natural result of not being pulled away by unnecessary thinking. When your mind is not overloaded with problems, it has more space to simply observe and act. Over time, this creates a different experience of life altogether. Things feel more fluid. Challenges come and go, but they don't leave the same residue. You deal with them, learn from them, and move on. There's less accumulation of stress because there's less attachment to what has already passed. There's also a quiet sense of confidence that runs beneath everything. Not loud, not dependent on outcomes, but steady. It comes from knowing that no matter what arises, you have a way of engaging with it that leads forward. And perhaps the most important realization at this point is how little you actually need to carry. You don't need to hold on to every problem, every mistake, every uncertainty. You don't need to solve everything at once. You only need to stay engaged with what matters now, and take the next step. That realization brings a kind of freedom. A freedom from overthinking, from unnecessary pressure, from the illusion that everything must be figured out before anything can begin. Instead, you move through life in a more direct way. You see what's in front of you, you decide what can be done, and you act. Then you adjust, and continue. And in that rhythm, see, decide, act, adjust, you find something that feels both simple and deeply effective. Not because it eliminates difficulty, but because it allows you to navigate it without losing yourself in the process. In the end, focusing on solutions is not just a way to handle problems. It's a way to stay aligned with movement, with clarity, and with progress. It's a way to keep your mind working for you. There's a point where everything you've been practicing begins to feel almost effortless, yet at the same time, more intentional than ever. It's not that challenges have disappeared or that life has become perfectly smooth. It's that your relationship with everything that happens has fundamentally changed. You're no longer trying to control the entire landscape. You're simply moving through it with clarity. At this stage, one of the most noticeable shifts is how quickly you recover. Earlier, setbacks might have lingered. A mistake, a missed opportunity, or an unexpected outcome could stay in your mind for hours, even days. You would replay it, analyze it, question it. But now, the recovery time shortens. Not because you ignore what happened, but because you don't stay there longer than necessary. You acknowledge, you extract what's useful, and then your attention naturally returns to what's next. There's no force involved. It's simply where your mind has learned to go. This ability to recover quickly becomes one of the most valuable aspects of a solution-focused life. Because in reality, progress is not about avoiding mistakes. It's about how efficiently you move forward after them. The less time you spend stuck, the more time you spend in motion. There's also a growing sense of trust in simplicity. You begin to notice that the most effective responses are often not complicated. A clear decision, a direct action, a small adjustment, these things solve more than long periods of overthinking ever could. And this simplicity extends into how you organize your life. You start letting go of unnecessary complexity, not just in your thinking, but in your actions. You focus on what matters, you reduce what doesn't, and you create space for clarity to remain. This doesn't mean you become minimal for the sake of it. It means you become selective. You choose what deserves your attention and effort, and you let the rest fade into the background. Another important shift is how you relate to momentum. Earlier, motivation might have felt inconsistent. Some days you felt driven, other days you didn't. And when motivation dropped, progress often slowed or stopped. But now, momentum becomes more reliable than motivation. You don't rely on feeling ready or inspired. You rely on the habit of taking the next step. And once you take that step, the next one becomes easier. This creates a kind of self-sustaining movement. You don't need to constantly push yourself, because you're already in motion. And staying in motion requires less effort than starting over again and again. There's also a deeper alignment between your thinking and your actions. Earlier, there might have been a gap, you knew what to do, but didn't always do it. Now, that gap becomes smaller. Not because you force discipline, but because your thinking naturally leads to action. When your focus is on solutions, action becomes the obvious next step. There's less internal resistance because you're not caught in conflicting thoughts or unnecessary doubts. You see what can be done, and you do it. This alignment creates a sense of integrity within yourself. You trust your own decisions more, because you consistently follow through on them. And that trust reinforces your ability to keep moving forward. There's also a shift in how you experience effort over time. What once felt difficult begins to feel normal. Not easy in the sense that it requires no energy, but natural in the sense that it fits how you operate. You no longer see effort as something to avoid. You see it as part of the process of building, improving, and moving forward. And because you're not resisting it, it feels lighter. At this level, patience and urgency find a kind of balance. You act when action is needed, but you don't rush unnecessarily. You allow things to develop, but you don't delay what can be done now. This balance creates a steady pace that is both productive and sustainable. There's also a clearer sense of direction that emerges, even if you don't have every detail figured out. You know what you're working toward, and more importantly, you know how to keep moving toward it. That clarity doesn't come from having perfect plans. It comes from consistently engaging with the process. Each step informs the next, and over time, the path becomes clearer because you've walked it. Another subtle change is how you experience external noise. Opinions, distractions, unexpected events, they still exist, but they have less influence over you. Because your focus is anchored, you're less likely to be pulled off course by things that don't align with your direction. You listen, you observe, but you decide what matters. And that decision shapes how you respond. There's also a growing sense of independence in your reference point. You can evaluate situations, make decisions, and adjust based on your own understanding. And that makes your actions more consistent, even when circumstances change. As all of this settles in, life begins to feel less like a series of problems to solve and more like a process to engage with. You're not constantly trying to fix everything. You're simply participating in what's unfolding, shaping it where you can, and moving forward where it makes sense. And in that participation, there's a quiet sense of fulfillment. Not because everything is perfect, but because you're no longer stuck. You're no longer waiting. You're no longer held back by patterns of thinking that lead nowhere. You're moving. Steadily, clearly, and with intention. And what becomes clear at this stage is that this way of thinking doesn't just help you navigate life, it changes the quality of it. It makes your experience lighter, your actions more effective, and your direction more consistent. But even now, there is still one final layer to uncover. Because beyond clarity, beyond action, beyond consistency, there is something even more subtle, a way of being that no longer depends on effort at all, yet continues to guide everything you do. Eventually, you arrive at a place where nothing about this feels like a method anymore. There are no reminders, no techniques running in the background, no effort to stay focused on solutions. And yet, everything you do carries that quality. It's no longer something you practice. It's something you are. At this level, the mind becomes quieter but also sharper. It doesn't chase every thought, and it doesn't get tangled in unnecessary complexity. When a situation appears, you see it for what it is. Not layered with assumptions, not distorted by past patterns, just clear enough to understand what matters. And from that clarity, action follows naturally. There's no internal debate about whether to move forward. There's no need to convince yourself to take the next step. The separation between thinking and doing becomes almost invisible. You see, you understand, and you act. Then you adjust, and continue. What's interesting is that this doesn't feel like control. It feels like alignment. As if your thoughts, your attention, and your actions are all moving in the same direction without friction. At this point, problems lose their psychological weight almost entirely. They still exist in a practical sense, things still go wrong, unexpected situations still arise, but they no longer carry the same emotional charge. They are simply part of the flow of events. You don't label them as obstacles in a dramatic way. You don't resist them. You don't overanalyze them. You engage with them, respond, and move on. This creates a kind of fluidity in how you experience life. There's less stopping and starting, less getting stuck, less needing to reset. You're already in motion, and you stay in motion. There's also a deeper sense of ease, but it's not passive. It's active ease. The kind that comes from not wasting energy on things that don't contribute to progress. You're still engaged, still thinking, still acting, but without the extra layer of mental strain. This ease allows you to handle more without feeling overwhelmed. Not because you're doing less, but because you're carrying less. You're not holding on to problems longer than necessary. You're not replaying situations that have already passed. You're not trying to solve everything at once. You deal with what's in front of you, fully, and then you let it go. There's also a shift in how you experience time. It no longer feels like something you're chasing or running out of. It feels more like something you're moving through steadily. Because you're not constantly distracted by unproductive thinking, your attention stays closer to the present. And when your attention is present, your actions become more effective. You make better use of each moment, not by rushing, but by being clear. This clarity also affects how you set and pursue goals. Goals are no longer heavy or intimidating. They're simply directions. You move toward them step by step, without needing to constantly measure how far you have left to go. And if the direction changes, you adjust without resistance. There's no attachment to a fixed path, only to meaningful movement. There's also a noticeable absence of internal pressure. Not because you've lowered your standards, but because you've changed how you relate to them. You still aim for improvement, still care about outcomes, but you don't carry the weight of needing everything to be perfect. You trust the process enough to let progress unfold. At this stage, even uncertainty feels different. It's no longer something you need to manage or reduce. It becomes without overthinking it. There's also a quiet confidence that becomes constant. Not a confidence that comes and goes based on results, but one that remains steady regardless of circumstances. It's built on the understanding that no matter what happens, you will respond, adjust, and continue. This confidence doesn't need to prove itself. It doesn't seek validation. It simply exists in the background of everything you do. And perhaps the most profound change is how little you need to think about yourself. Earlier, much of your thinking might have been centered around your own performance, your own problems, your own progress. Now, that focus softens. You're more engaged with what you're doing than with how you're doing. More focused on the process than on yourself within it. This creates a sense of freedom that's hard to describe but easy to feel. You're no longer caught in your own head. You're simply present, engaged, and moving. And in that state, focusing on solutions is no longer a deliberate act. It's the natural outcome of a clear mind. You don't need to remind yourself to look for what works. You naturally see it. You don't need to force yourself to take action. You naturally move. You don't need to manage your thoughts constantly. They settle into patterns that support you rather than hold you back. Life, at this point, doesn't become perfect, but it becomes workable in a way that feels steady and reliable. You trust yourself to navigate whatever comes. You trust the process of adjusting and continuing. And you trust that progress, in some form, is always available. And that's where everything comes together. Not in a dramatic realization, not in a final breakthrough, but in a quiet, consistent way of being, where clarity replaces confusion, movement replaces hesitation, and solutions are no longer something you search for, but something you naturally create, one moment at a time. There's a final shift that feels less like an addition and more like a quiet subtraction. By this point, it's not about learning anything new. It's about what naturally falls away. The need to explain, the habit of holding onto every detail, the tendency to mentally revisit what has already passed, these things begin to dissolve on their own. What remains is a kind of clean awareness. You see situations as they arise, you understand what matters, and you respond without unnecessary layers. There's no extra weight added by overthinking or hesitation. And because of that, everything feels more direct. You begin to notice how little is actually required to move forward. Not in a minimalistic or restrictive sense, but in a practical one. Most situations don't need complex strategies or prolonged analysis. They need a clear decision and a step. And once that step is taken, the next one reveals itself. This realization simplifies everything. It changes how you approach even the biggest challenges. Instead of seeing them as large, overwhelming structures that need to be solved all at once, you see them as sequences. Each part can be engaged with, one at a time. And because your focus is always on the next meaningful step, you never feel completely stuck. There's always something you can do. This creates a steady rhythm in your life. Not rushed, not forced, but continuous. You move from one step to the next with a kind of quiet consistency. And over time, that consistency builds results that feel almost surprising, not because they were unexpected, but because they came together without struggle. There's also a deeper sense of detachment, but it's not indifference. You still care, you still engage, you still put in effort. But you're no longer emotionally entangled in every outcome. You do what you can, as well as you can, and then you let the result be what it is. This detachment brings a kind of stability that isn't easily shaken. When things go well, you appreciate it without becoming dependent on it. When things don't go well, you adjust without becoming discouraged. Your direction remains steady, regardless of fluctuations. There's also a quiet clarity in how you evaluate situations. You're no longer trying to label everything as good or bad, right or wrong. You're simply asking, does this move things forward or not? And based on that, you decide what to do next. This removes a lot of unnecessary mental noise. You're not caught in judgment or over-interpretation. You're focused on movement. And because of that, your decisions become faster and more precise. Not rushed, but clean. You don't need to process every possible angle. You understand enough to act, and you trust your ability to adjust if needed. There's also a shift in how you experience effort over the long term. Earlier, effort might have felt like something you had to constantly manage, about whether something is hard or easy. You think about whether it's necessary, and if it is, you do it. This removes a lot of internal resistance. You're no longer negotiating with yourself. There's less friction between intention and action. At this stage, even your relationship with goals becomes lighter. You still have direction, still have things you're working toward, but you're not fixated on endpoints. You're engaged with the process. You understand that what matters is not just reaching a goal, but how you move toward it. The quality of your thinking, the clarity of your actions, the consistency of your steps, these become the real measures of progress. And because of that, you don't feel like you're constantly chasing something. You feel like you're already in it. There's also a sense of quiet independence that settles in. You're less influenced by external noise, less affected by shifting opinions or changing circumstances. Not because you ignore them, but because your direction is internally grounded. You listen, you consider, but you decide. And that decision comes from a place of clarity rather than pressure. Perhaps one of the most noticeable changes is how you experience peace. Not as something separate from action, not as something you find only when everything is resolved, but as something that exists within movement itself. You don't need everything to be perfect to feel settled. You don't need every problem to be solved. You simply need to be engaged in a way that feels clear and aligned. That becomes enough. And in that state, life feels less like something you're trying to manage and more like something you're participating in. You're not standing outside of it, analyzing it constantly. You're inside it, moving with it. You respond when needed, you act when it makes sense, and you allow things to unfold without unnecessary interference. There's a kind of trust that underlies all of this. Not blind trust, not passive acceptance, but a grounded understanding that as long as you remain clear and engaged, you will find your way through whatever arises. You don't need to have everything figured out. You don't need to predict every outcome. You just need to stay connected to what matters and keep moving. And when you look back, you begin to see that this entire journey was never really about solving problems in the traditional sense. It was about changing your relationship with thinking, with attention, and with action. It was about learning to direct your energy toward what builds rather than what drains. It was about realizing that progress is always available, not in perfect leaps, but in small, consistent steps. And most of all, it was about discovering that the way you engage with life shapes everything. Not just what you achieve, but how you experience each moment along the way. And once that becomes clear, there's nothing more to add. Only to continue. And in the end, what remains is not a system, not a technique, not even a set of ideas you need to remember. What remains is a way of seeing and moving that feels so natural, it no longer feels like something you learned. You don't wake up thinking about focusing on solutions. You simply begin your day, and when something arises, your attention moves in a direction that leads somewhere. There's no internal instruction, no mental checklist. Just a quiet, steady orientation toward what can be done. And that's the real shift. Because at the beginning, it might have felt like effort, like you had to remind yourself to think differently, to ask better questions, to avoid getting stuck in problems. But now, there's nothing to remind. The old patterns have lost their grip, not because you forced them out, but because you stopped feeding them. What once felt automatic has been replaced by something more useful, and over time, that has become automatic instead. You start to see life less as something to figure out and more as something to engage with. Situations come and go, some easy, some difficult, but none of them hold you in place for long. You meet them, you respond, and you move. There's a kind of quiet rhythm to it. You notice what's in front of you. You decide what matters. You take a step, and then you adjust, again and again, without strain. And in that rhythm, there's a sense of trust that runs deeper than anything else. Not a loud or emotional kind of trust, but a steady knowing that you don't need to have everything under control to keep moving forward. This trust changes how you experience even the uncertain parts of life. You no longer feel the need to resolve everything before taking action. You're comfortable moving with incomplete information because you've learned that clarity often comes after the first step, not before it. There's also a kind of freedom that settles in, but it doesn't come from external circumstances. It comes from the absence of unnecessary mental weight. You're not carrying every past mistake. You're not replaying every conversation. You're not trying to predict every possible outcome. You're simply present enough to see what matters now. And that presence makes everything feel more manageable. Even when life becomes demanding, even when responsibilities increase, even when the path ahead isn't clear, you don't feel overwhelmed in the same way. Because you're not trying to solve everything at once. You're just taking the next step, and then the next, and then the next. There's also a quiet satisfaction in this way of living. Not the kind that comes from reaching a final destination, but the kind that comes from being aligned with what you're doing. You're not constantly questioning whether you're on the right path, because you're engaged with the process itself. You're thinking clearly, acting intentionally, and adjusting when needed. That becomes enough. And over time, you realize something simple but profound: most of what once felt complicated was never about the situations themselves. It was about how you were engaging with them. When your attention was scattered, everything felt heavier. When your thinking was stuck in loops, everything felt slower. When your focus was on problems, everything felt harder. But now, with your attention directed toward what can be done, things begin to move. Not perfectly, not instantly, but consistently. And that consistency changes everything. Because life, in the end, is not shaped by a few big moments, but by the direction you move in every day. The small decisions, the small actions, the small adjustments, they add up. And when those are guided by clarity instead of confusion, by movement instead of hesitation, by solutions instead of problems, the overall direction of your life begins to shift. Not dramatically, but steadily. And that steady shift is what creates real change. So there's nothing left to master here. No final technique, no hidden layer, no extra step. Just this: see clearly. Focus on what can be done. Take the next step. Adjust as you go. And keep moving. Because as long as you do that, you're never truly stuck. You're always in motion. And in that motion, you'll find that solutions are not something distant or difficult to reach. They're something you create, moment by moment, through the way you choose to think, the way you choose to act, and the direction you choose to move. And once you understand that, not just intellectually, but through experience, the journey doesn't end. It simply becomes your way of living.